Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very important information session to learn more about the upcoming 2021 municipal budget. I'm Sasha Novak and I will be your moderator this evening. I want to begin by thanking Mayor Brian Bigger for joining us tonight, along with Mike Jakubo, Councillor for Ward 7 and Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee, and Deb McIntosh, Councillor for Ward 9 and Vice Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. Each will be available during the question and answer period. I also want to take a minute to introduce our executive leadership team and budget staff here with us. They will also be on hand to answer your questions about the budget and budget process. Ed Archer, Chief Administrative Officer, Kevin Folk, General Manager of Corporate Services, Steve Jakes, General Manager of Community Development, Joseph Nichols, General Manager of Community Safety, Tony Cicuti, General Manager of Growth and Infrastructure, Ed Stankiewicz, Executive Director of Finance, Assets and Fleet, Ian Wood, Executive Director, Strategic Initiatives, Communications and Citizen Services, Marie L'Italian, Director of Communications and Engagement, Brett Williamson, Director of Economic Development, and Steve Facey, Manager of Financial Planning and Budgeting. Tonight's session will begin with presentations, which will last approximately 30 minutes, followed by an hour-long question and answer period. We will begin taking questions tonight through the Q&A tool you see on your screen. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the evening. As a follow-up, we will be publishing your questions with the answers on our Over to You engagement platform in the coming days. As well, we are keeping the Q&A tool open on Over to You and will continue to accept and answer questions throughout the budget process. This session is being held via Zoom and is being recorded. It will later be available on the city's website at greatersudbury.ca/budget and on the 2021 budget project page on overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. Closed captioning is an option. You can go to live transcript on your screen to turn it on and off. All right, let's begin now with opening remarks from Mayor Brian Bigger.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and good evening to everyone. Bonjour à tous, Oni. I want to begin by thanking everyone who has virtually joined us tonight to talk about the upcoming municipal budget. Je vous remercie d'être ici. Special thanks to our Finance and Administration Committee Chair and Vice Chair, Councillor Jakubo, and Councillor McIntosh for being here tonight as well. I would say it's been a very challenging year for all of us. And as a municipality, the COVID-19 pandemic rewrote our plans for 2020. But regardless of the hurdles thrown at us, I continue to be impressed by the resilience of our community, and I anticipate this will continue in 2021. As you know, the municipal budget is the city's business plan for the year, and it describes the costs and the revenues needed to deliver municipal services to our community. For the 2021 municipal budget, Council has provided direction to staff based on 5 areas: analysis of capital planning and debt financing, options for adjustments to user fees, rationalizing facilities to improve use, funds to cover COVID shortfalls, and capital spending for infrastructure renewal needs to support Council's strategic plan priorities. Very shortly, Councillor Jakubo will introduce the budget and provide insight on its progress. And senior staff in the budget team are also here tonight, led by Mr. Archer and Mr. Kevin Folk. They'll provide specifics on the upcoming budget, including the direction offered by City Council and how our staff is planning to achieve these guidelines. I'd also like to thank everyone who provided feedback and questions regarding the budget on the Over to You at greatersudbury.ca platform. Engagement for this budget has the highest online participation of any budget we've had over the years. And so your input is crucial to the budget process, and we could not establish an annual budget without hearing from you, the residents in our community. Council will be receiving this feedback prior to budget deliberations starting on February 24th. And we will consider this information as we work to establish the budget for 2021. As we plan for 2021 and the coming years, we'll continue to work toward achieving the goals set out by Council's strategic plan, and I'm confident we will persevere and lead our community forward in a strong and stable financial future. I encourage everyone here tonight to participate and share what you feel is important for you and your family. And with that being said, I look forward to the rest of tonight's session, and I'm here alongside the staff members in attendance tonight to answer any questions you might have. And so I'd like to thank you and say merci, miigwech.
Thank you, Mayor Bigger. Now we will hear from Mike Jakubo, Councillor for Ward 7 and Chair of the Finance and Administration Committee. He will introduce the 2021 proposed municipal budget. That will be followed by a presentation from Mr. Archer and Ms. L'Italien.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you very much for the introduction, Mayor Bigger. In the mayor's opening remarks, he spoke about our council strategic plan priorities. You can see them up on the screen, and these are council approved priorities, which range from ensuring a high level of service delivery for our residents, to managing and addressing climate change, to making strategic investments, which instill confidence in our residents and business community, and continue to make Greater Sudbury an attractive city to live, work, play, and invest. And to that end, Budget 2021 continues to invest in our existing infrastructure at an enhanced level, which we must continue to do so that we do not allow our infrastructure deficit to widen. Budget 2021, in some cases, also shows temporary service level adjustments for activities and services which are currently restricted under provincial orders and which have been significantly restricted or banned for much of 2020 under the provincial phased lockdown structure. I must stress that these are not permanent adjustments, just as COVID-19 is not permanent for us. But they are adjustments that do make sense in the current and projected state of the pandemic and how it will play out through 2021. I'll ask for the next slide, please. Important in our budget process, and indeed important to any decision that our council makes, is benchmarking. To that end, our city takes part in the annual BMA study and other benchmarking initiatives to keep our decision-making grounded and comparable. One question or comment we often hear is that our taxes are high, or why does there have to be a continuous percentage increase to the taxes every year? And I'm going to answer that in two parts. First, on this slide, this shows the results of the 2020 BMA study, which compares the level of property taxation across all cities in Ontario with over 100,000 population. In this group of comparatives, you can see Greater Sudbury has the second lowest in Ontario in 2020. And we have been close to the lowest in Ontario for the last several years. What that means is that all these cities offer a similar basket of services to their communities, and Greater Sudbury does so with great value for our citizens. Next slide, please. Many people also ask where we stand in comparison to our Northern Ontario counterparts. And again, from this slide, you can see that Greater Sudbury is second lowest in Northern Ontario and also below the group average. So once Budget 2021 and the related tax policy are approved, Greater Sudbury will still have one of the lowest relative property tax levels in all of Ontario. Another thing we know is that our city's costs continue to increase every year. And they do not rise simply at the rate of general inflation. Our costs are things like freely negotiated collective agreements with set annual increases to wages and benefits, They are things like asphalt and concrete, which have risen in cost at rates closer to 6 and 8% annually in recent years. All told, our city's annual actual inflation rate is probably closer to 5% than the common inflation rate of 1 to 2%. And that is why our long-term financial plan recommends annual increases to property taxes and user fees. So with this draft budget set for an increase of 3.9%, which is in line with our long-term financial plan, staff has worked with some of the council direction that you heard the mayor mention earlier, and has presented a fiscally responsible service delivery plan for 2021. It's a plan that stresses that services drive costs, highlights cost pressures that have resulted from what is a large suite of services that the city offers. These are pressures that are starting to build in 2021 and will continue to build in 2022, which means that this budget process and the ensuing budget process in 2022 will require some very important decisions to be made. So now that council has received the draft budget from staff, it moves over to the Finance and Administration Committee so that we can deliberate, debate, and ultimately approve a final 2021 budget for the City of Greater Sudbury. We look forward to starting that process on the 24th, as the mayor mentioned. And with that, I will hand things over to our CAO, Ed Archer, to continue the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Chair Jakubo. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this discussion. As Mayor Bigger and Councillor Jakubo have noted, what you are looking at tonight, and hopefully what you've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, is a draft budget. That is, it is staff's recommendations for fulfilling the directions that council provided back in November to support a set of service delivery plans that remain affordable for the community and that reflect the community's highest priorities. But of course, because it is a recommended plan, and there are still opportunities for some dialogue about whether what the recommendations reflect is in line with what the community's expectations look like, the committee's deliberations over the next several weeks and your participation are very important. The input that you provide is sincerely appreciated, and it is something that councillors consider very carefully in putting together their thoughts about what the right set of services and the right level of financing requirements are for the next 12 months. And the next slide, please. So I'll take you back to early November. The beginning of our budget process always begins with a report from staff to the Finance and Administration Committee that gives the committee an opportunity to set what we call budget directions. These are instructions, the walls within which we build the plan that delivers our 58 lines of service to the community for the next 12 months. And among the directions we received from the committee in November was an instruction to build a plan for 2021 that had no more than a 3.9% change in property taxation, and to show the committee what service adjustments would be required to change that 3.9 to either 3 or 2.2%. So for context, you see on this slide an illustration of what a 3.9% change in property taxation looks like in 2021. And recall, of course, that property taxes are based on two factors: the volume of funds required from taxes in the budget and your assessed property value. So municipalities must have a balanced budget. We have a requirement every year mandated by the provincial government to ensure that our revenues equal our expenditures, and to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to enjoy the services. Council considers what the service levels will look like. And then the discussion about who pays and how much is a conversation that typically happens each spring when we talk about what we call tax policy. And the tax policy discussion establishes standards and formulas that, based on the value of your property, determine what share of the municipal budget your property will be charged. And that way, everyone pays according to the value of their property and the budget remains balanced. And the next slide, please. As part of deciding the budget directions, the committee's getting information from us about a variety of factors that describe our understanding of the circumstances we're managing. So it considers the economic circumstances within the community. It considers the service changes that we know are coming because of, for example, things like provincial regulatory changes or new policies established by council throughout 2020, for example, that determine a different service level will be applied in 2021 than in the current period. Or other cost changes that we know we will incur, as, for example, Councillor Jakubo noted, the results of collective bargaining processes or new contracts with service partners that anticipate a change in cost. Those changes can go up or down. And we see in 2021 the benefits of contract changes that have gone down through our waste collection service contract and the changes that council made to the service level there. And then we have other increases as well. And those examples include cost changes related to our COVID-19 virus response, where we anticipate spending significantly more than we have historically for things like personal protective equipment and funding the service changes that we made to ensure that both visitors to our facilities and our staff remain as safe as possible in that environment. And so there's been process and physical changes in the buildings that need to be funded to ensure that supplies for hand sanitizer, for example, or masks are regularly available. Those influencing factors are described in a way that lets council understand if we maintain the same service levels and we make no other changes, the initial tax change has a value. And in this case, it was going to represent a 7.9% change over 2020's net costs. And of course, we know, and the committee agreed, that represented a level of change that would likely not be supported by the community. And so the budget directions gave us instructions to make some adjustments for the committee's review. And so we did. In building the plan across our 58 lines of service and approximately $700 million of expenditures, we made a variety of adjustments. In some cases, we received external financial support from senior levels of government. So the provincial and federal governments have been supporting municipalities and various other sectors, frankly, throughout 2020 to offset some of the impacts of the COVID-19 virus, because it's not only cost increases that we're experiencing, and as I'll describe a little bit later in a little more detail, it's also revenue reductions. A lot of our services rely on user fees to fund the programs that people enjoy. And of course, many of those programs haven't been available, so we're not earning those revenues. Similarly, our transit service relies to a degree on fare box revenue that hasn't been able to be realized because transit ridership is significantly down for very understandable and clear reasons. So those additional funding sources from the senior governments have helped offset that tax increase to reduce it from 7.9% down almost 2.5% through the funding announcements that the province and the federal government made in late 2020. We also had to make service level adjustments, and those were considered draft, of course, and they still are draft, but they were considered further by the Finance and Administration Committee in late December, so that everybody approaches this budget with their eyes open. We have a variety of services, and we know that everyone doesn't use all of them, but somebody uses each one of them, and they're important to someone in our community. Any adjustments will be met with some skepticism, or at least a need and an opportunity to understand why those services were adjusted and not some other ones. And so there's been careful deliberations and very public discussions beginning in December with the Finance Committee about what service adjustments could be made to ensure that the budget remain balanced and stay within the guidelines that the Finance Committee gave us. And so the funding from additional sources and the adjustments that we made or that we recommend to service levels produced the plan that's on the table right now. And that meets the 3.9% levy change goal. The next slide, please. So those service level adjustments represent a variety of changes in the way we do business. So some represent changes across the organization. There'll be service effects felt in a variety of ways in different parts of the organization, like, for example, by changing the number of summer students that we hire. That will affect services such as traffic and transportation, our recreation services, our park services. Those are areas that rely to a very high degree on summer students. We'll hire fewer of them, therefore, the service levels in those areas will be different. We also established recommendations for changes to specific services. And as the committee will deliberate, I'm sure, extensively over the next several weeks, there are changes anticipated to specific services that don't affect the whole organization, but do affect those services in particular, like, for example, with respect to museums. And because of the discussions that we've been having around rationalizing the number of facilities that we have to serve our community, changes that could be applied to our pools and arena services as well. Some of the other adjustments involved changing the assumptions that we make about things like when we have to make the timing of our debt payments and factor those into the financing plans for our budget. We can change those typically on a one-time basis, and in this year we did that. We also changed the way we finance some of our capital renewal. So we charge the users of the vehicles and equipment that we have throughout the organization a rate based on an assumption that at a point in time, typically 5 to 7 years, those pieces of equipment or vehicles will be replaced using the funds that were charged to the users that use those vehicles or equipment. We adjusted those rates, so either those vehicles will stay in service longer or we'll have to have more of a draw from our capital budget to support their replacement. We also made adjustments to changes in the assumptions we had about things like fuel prices and knocked those down so as to reduce the overall cost of the fuel service in our budget, but we accept the risk when we do that, that the price could be different than what we forecast. And if it is, and it's more, then we have an exposure in our budget that at some point in the year, we have to make other adjustments to address. Can I have the next slide, please? And there are several risks in this budget that we maintain awareness about and that we regularly manage as a normal part of the business that we deliver. There are some exceptional ones, of course, like with respect to, for example, COVID-19. And I've mentioned some of them already. We've had decreased revenues from the programs that rely on user fees. We've had higher expenditures for ensuring that our staff and the people who visit our facilities have appropriate personal protective equipment, and that includes things as simple as hand sanitizer and masks. We've also enhanced service levels in some areas throughout our community, and particularly, and many would notice, the changes that we've made in 2020 to support those vulnerable members of our community who rely on our social services or who need assistance with housing. These impacts have been similarly felt by our service partners. City Council funds a variety of other organizations that deliver important community services as well, and they, like us, have gone through similar experiences with the COVID-19 response. Other elements that inform our plans, of course, include the condition of our assets. We have a variety of services that are very asset intensive. Many of those assets are reaching the end of their useful lives. They're 40 or 50 or more years old. They wear out. And in some cases, we've reached the point where they've worn out or they are almost worn out. So replacing those or deciding to keep them going for a little while longer and avoiding that big ticket cost does come with some risk, because if the service is interrupted because of an asset failure, residents are disappointed the service isn't available, and potential for us to pay more to repair that asset is in front of us. Of course, we rely a lot on local economic conditions and our understanding of how the local economy is performing. In this case, we are relatively well positioned, I believe. The local economy, as we've heard from a variety of statistics, is performing relatively better than provincial or national levels at this point. So that's good news. Of course, that changes over time. Economic development initiatives and the potential for us to grow our property tax assessment base is always part of our consideration. And how much growth we're able to enjoy in the community is a function of several factors and involves a reliance on the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation to capture that information about growth and record it so that it can affect our property tax rules. And we rely regularly on funding from senior levels of government. So COVID-19 funding has been important, but we also receive funding for our social services. We receive funding for capital grants and infrastructure initiatives that both the federal and provincial government undertake from time to time. And they're important elements of our financing plans. Next slide, please. So where the money goes is described here on this slide. And you see the bulk of our expenditures relate to services that most of us don't use. We talk about police service or fire service or paramedic services. These are services that are core to any community's quality of life. And they're fundamentally important, but very few of us actually use them. But when we need them, we want them to be there. And you see that they are together the largest share of our overall expenditures. Road maintenance is the next largest expenditure. Greater Sudbury's road network is one of the largest any community has to manage in the country. And because of that, of course, our expenditures for roads is certainly out of proportion to the value of other services that are equally important to members of our community. But it does, if we're going to maintain that network, require significant expenditures. Our benchmarking data shows us that we're as efficient as any community in the province when it comes to road maintenance activities. The volume of our road network means that we spend relatively more. The next slide, please. So I've described in a couple of different ways how our operating budget, that is the budget that funds our day-to-day programs and services, is influenced by several pressures that can either increase our costs or reduce our revenue. And this slide simply illustrates many of those pressures that we navigate as we finalize the draft budget for committee's consideration. I've talked about the COVID-19 impacts. Our road maintenance and winter control budget is always an important part of the discussion because it is large and because it is something that residents regularly tell us is a very important part of our service mix. We know we have work to do to improve the overall quality of our roads. And I think if you've paid attention over the last couple of years, you've seen significant investments in particularly our arterial roads. And I'd say you've also noticed then the quality of those roads has changed for the better. I think we'll see in a later slide that generally people have noticed the same kind of thing. I've talked about contract increases. That includes things like employee benefit changes or changes in our costs for having employees with respect to the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, and revenue losses. Those factors can affect us in many different ways, but generally the bottom line is they either add costs or they reduce our potential for earning revenue. And if we're going to sustain our services, the offset to lower revenue is a change in taxation. The next slide, please. From the perspective of making sure that our city is maintained at a level that supports the economic and social activities that go on, we invest a lot in infrastructure every year. And this year, we're investing over $100 million in asset renewal or introducing new assets to support things like our road network and making sure that facilities that everyone relies on, whether that's for recreation or for business, is available when they need them. At the same time, we're changing the way we do business in several different ways, and that's accelerated because of our COVID response. So more and more of our services are becoming available online, and we're making investments in technology to ensure that our customer service is as responsive as people expect and as efficient as it can be. So a most recent example of that, of course, is the recent implementation we've made of our customer relationship management system, where you can now talk to our 311 operators via text and have most of your issues resolved with that one call. That's a relatively new change and an evolution in our approach to customer service that we think is a really important and effective approach. But it wasn't always that way. And it's thanks to the investments we've made in technology and the investments we've made in training our staff to be able to make that service as effective as it is. Can I have the next slide, please? We also want to ensure that we facilitate the community's growth, and whether that's through investments that leverage private sector opportunities, or that we reflect in the course of building our strategic plan goals and efforts to produce the outcomes that that plan anticipates, investments that support a good quality of life for everybody, regardless of their area of interest or their focus. We also want to make sure that our transit system, which has undergone significant change in the last couple of years, continues its plans for growth and supporting those who need to rely on that service for work, for school, or just for getting around the community. We're also taking steps in our capital plan to protect against the risk of failure. And you see that especially in our water and wastewater services. Water and wastewater services are a little different in that they don't rely on tax dollars to support the service. They're completely 100% user pay. But the capital plan anticipates investments in things like our automated meters, for example, or new pipes that replace older 80-some-year-old pipes that reduce the risk of breaking and creating a service interruption. And in a freeze-thaw cycle like what we're about to go through over the next few months, those kinds of projects become very important. The next slide, please. We also have a method through this process of budgeting that gives council and staff an opportunity to consider other changes in the way we do business. Those are called business cases in our world, and they represent unique choices that council can make to adjust our service mix, either increase a level of service or reduce a level of service or add a new service that we consider in this process on an individual basis. The value of business cases for committee's consideration this year is approximately $6 million. This is important not just for the one-time expenditure that may sometimes be incurred if the committee supports the business case. It's important as well because often there are impacts on future years' budgets. So we present a story about why this investment may be worthwhile, and we present as well the financial implications associated with it. So again, everybody has their eyes open when they make the decision, and the understanding that needs to exist to support that service for years to come is there when the vote happens. And the next slide, please. I mentioned the water and wastewater services. They're part of this budget process, but it is separate from the taxation discussions that we have, because as I said, they are funded entirely by user rates. There's a long-range financial plan associated with water and wastewater services, just like one we have for our tax-supported services. And it is a heavily regulated, highly fixed cost business. So the long-range financial plan for water wastewater services anticipates a rate change of 4.8%. How much that affects an individual user depends on how much water they use. But typically, there'd be about a $64 change in their annual costs. The next slide, please. The City of Greater Sudbury's 58 lines of service are an important element of this budget, and they are the main focus of the discussions, but they are not the only part of the budget. You see here a list of the service partners who rely to some extent on support from council to do what they do for the community. The Greater Sudbury Airport is an example of a subsidiary corporation that requires no tax support, but it is accountable to City Council and its volunteer board, and the staff relationships we have with the airport maintain a regular and close collaboration with municipal operations. Conservation Sudbury, of course, has a lot to do with our environmental stewardship, and it's seeing a significant increase over its 2020 budget that its board deliberated about, just like our finance committee is doing. Public Health Sudbury and Districts relies to an extent on funding from municipal councils across the province, and ours is no different. And in that case, the plan anticipates a 5% change. Greater Sudbury Police Service relies almost exclusively on tax-supported funding for its budget, and it anticipates a 4.8% change over last year's. And our Greater Sudbury Public Library Service is another institution that provides valuable services to the community, and its draft budget anticipates a 5.7% increase over last year's amount. So these are parts of council's deliberations, and in these cases, council's level of influence over these budgets is limited to saying yes or no. The boards have recommended them to the committee for consideration, The Finance Committee can agree with the board's recommendation, or it can send it back to that board for further deliberations, sometimes with suggestions about where changes may be made, but generally with the idea that the board will reconsider based on council's feedback and present a revised budget if that's the committee's wish. Okay, the next slide, please. So that's broadly how the 2021 budget came together and what it contains. I'll ask Ms. L'Italien to describe what's going to happen next.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. On January 19th, oh, could you go back to the last slide, please? Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. On January 19th, the proposed 2021 budget was presented to the Finance and Administration Committee of Council. Budget deliberations begin in late February and continue into March. And in mid-March, Council will approve the 2021 budget. Next slide, please. As you can all imagine, 2021 budget engagement looked a little different because ongoing restrictions on in-person gatherings and community interest was focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. We very much focused on a simple way to present educational information, all while gaining valuable feedback from residents. It was open for more than 5 weeks with opportunities to share ideas, use our tax calculator, and complete a survey, all while browsing informative documents and multimedia. And while the focus was online, residents who may not have access or be comfortable using technology could call 311 to provide their thoughts. This was new, but also important given the closure of some municipal facilities, and also keeping in mind that some people may not want to access in-person services due to their personal circumstances. Although it was our first year, 13 residents took advantage of this option, and we've continued to provide this service for other engagement opportunities. I'm happy to report that we saw a significant increase in participation this year, with 511 surveys completed and 160 ideas received. Next slide, please. The goal of the budget engagement is to reflect the priorities of the community through data gathered by participant response. This can change year after year based on our local circumstances. Some of you attending this evening may have submitted feedback, and I want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this very important engagement opportunity. You can see at a very high level, 2021 priorities have somewhat changed, with the top 3 service areas identified as very important being water and wastewater, winter road maintenance, and construction. Next slide, please. We are just about finished completing the reports. It turns out we have so much great feedback. We have hundreds of pages to get together for this. These details will be shared with Council shortly, and then with the public and with survey participants to close the loop. They'll be posted to the website and over to you. Additionally, the questions and feedback we received this evening will be posted out on our various online platforms and shared with City Council. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. That concludes our presentation for tonight, and I will pass it on to Ms. Novak.
Thank you so much to everyone. That concludes the presentation. This session is now open for questions. A reminder to submit your questions, go to the Q&A tool on your screen. And we're going to begin with a question both Leslie and Marg sent in. The Anderson Farm Museum Heritage Society is very concerned about the proposed draft budget cut of $168,038 from the 4 museums in the city of Greater Sudbury. We have been made aware that the curator's position may be cut. We have submitted documents to council for your review and would insist on the curator's job and the funding to all 4 museums stay in the budget and not be cut. Does the city value and want to preserve and protect, expand and develop the history of CGS housed in the Anderson Farm Museum, Coppercliff, Flour Mill and Rayside Balfour museums as vital heritage sites now and for future generations? If you do, you must value the role of the curator hired to be responsible for preserving and protecting, expanding and developing our local history. This is possibly a question for Mr. Wood.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. So thanks for the question. It is an important question, and I certainly understand the passion of the volunteers and those associated with the museums and heritage committees across the city. the first thing I would say is that, you know, the draft budget is not a reflection of the value of the position or of the individual in that position. This option really arose. Museums have not operated in 2020 and will not operate again in 2021. So given the need to identify opportunities for savings in various areas, service areas, the potential was identified to suspend the operations completely for 2021 and perhaps indefinitely. I also want to mention that this is not an abandonment of the museum sites. That this is a staffing reduction. The budgets for utilities and building maintenance are not reduced, and city staff will work with the various groups, particularly at Anderson Farm and in the wood shop, for access and events. In a broader context, we had already been looking at our museum operations and concerned that we were not well organized or financially supported to the degree required for long term. Not earlier this year, but last year we completed a high-level review which identified the need for more in-depth examinations of our buildings, our artifact preservation ability and storage capabilities, the museum governance, and general operations. And we were concerned that the current budget, even as it stands now, if it were not reduced, is not really sustainable over the long term, given the number of sites and the expectations and the general requirements of a modern museum. And we also believe that the suspension of the current program may be an opportunity to determine exactly how the community and the city want to fund and deliver museum services. As Mr. Archer mentioned previously, this is a draft budget at this point, but that's certainly the perspective of staff that we will continue to bring to the table.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Next question is, the pandemic has highlighted issues of income inequality in our region. One key way to reduce income inequality is to ensure that workers receive a living wage. The Sudbury Workers Education and Advocacy Centre, in partnership with the Ontario Living Wage Network, calculated the living wage for the City of Greater Sudbury at $16.98 in 2019. Will the City of Greater Sudbury support the elimination of income inequality in our community by taking the leadership step of becoming a certified living wage employer and committing to pay all employees of City of Greater Sudbury the living wage as calculated for our region?
Hello, Sasha, it's Ed. I think I'd defer to Kevin Folk for response to this question, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Mr. Archer, and thanks, Sasha. So this is an excellent question, and it's one that, frankly, I've been working for the city now for about, 10 or 11 years, much of it in human resources and organizational development, and hadn't turned a ton of thought to. I'd ask the question submitter to consider us, though, in terms of our record, and so currently, our negotiated agreements with the Canadian Union of Public Employees and our other partner unions feature classifications which are paid in excess of the wage for, as I understand the standard, full-time employees. You would find very few full-time employees employed by the City of Greater Sudbury paid below that living wage rate. I'd point to two other policies of ours as well. Our approach to compensation at the city is to differentiate between levels of employees and persons that we employ, and classifications and duties that we require on the basis of wages. Our full-time employees enjoy, by and large, the very same benefit suite as all others that work for the organization. And so there is a high rate from a benefits and pension perspective that you could apply over and above wages that is relatively uniform, right from the full-time employee that may be in the lower wage steps of the inside and the outside unit to the CAO's role. I'd also point to the existence at the City of Greater Sudbury of a fair wage policy, which indicates that in accordance with the province's fair wage schedule, all of the bids and tenders that the city makes available for the city's construction contracts demand and inform bidders that the contractor and any subcontractors that are employed will amend by and comply with the fair wage policy and the fair wage schedule. And so we have the trappings here of a lot of elements that I think address the good question here that's been raised by this question submitter. And so it is not a question that we've put to City Council in terms of the actual fair wage employer designation. It's certainly something we could look at. And I don't believe in your draft budget that we're talking about this evening, you'll find many full-time classifications that are paid below that rate in terms of pure wage. And as I've mentioned, certainly not in terms of wages and benefits and pensions, sort of total compensation. And so I hope that provides a bit of an answer, but I think it starts a discussion potentially for City Council and for staff to consider that kind of designation. We understand the importance of income equality, and it is one step further in that direction. And I admire the work that I'm now learning about that the Fair Wage group has been doing across the province. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Folk. Our next question is possibly for Mr. Jakubo. How much money does the city receive from other corporations for use of its landfill facilities? And are any of these other corporations cities or municipalities?
Thank you, Sasha. That's an interesting question. I don't know the total dollar values involved. I can respond that we charge a rate for disposal of waste at the city's landfill site. It is charged on the basis of the tonnage of material that is disposed at the city landfill site. The rate is established to consider the cost of operating that landfill site. We do apply that rate even to city departments in the case of where a city department is doing a construction project and there's demolition debris or refuse. So we do charge local contractors as well. And anybody essentially that is bringing material to the landfill site has to pay by the ton. We of course do not charge for our own vehicles, but there is an accounting for the domestic waste and debris that goes, and that ends up being applied to the tax base. So unfortunately, I don't have a specific percentage to answer the question directly, but to say that there is a fair rate that's charged to anybody that disposes material at the landfill site. There are other services available as well, such as commercial recycling material. There is the disposal of green cart material at our city landfill site as well. And there is a construction debris site being set up. There is an opportunity for reuse of materials. So we manage material that's brought to the landfill site that could be reused, set it aside for people to purchase that material as well. So hopefully that addresses the question, Sasha. If clarity is required, if there's a follow-up question, I'm available.
Thank you, Mr. Jakubo. This may be another one for you. It's in relation to asphalt resurfacing and the hot in place recycling pilot project. The question is, given what happened on Cambrian Heights this year, where the motorized vehicle travel lanes were resurfaced, but the edges where the bike route is were not because of the nature of the resurfacing, can you confirm that this project would include the whole road, including the active transportation area? This would be especially important on roads like Bancroft, which is a lot of cycling traffic and where the road edges in many areas are not in the best shape. This may or may not impact budget conversations that are currently happening.
Thank you, Sasha, for the question. So I guess I'm going to start at the end and confirm that so the scope of an individual capital project does not directly affect the budgeting process. There certainly is allocation set aside from the operating budget towards capital projects, and that allocation, including any reserves set aside for capital or any contributions from external sources of funding, make up what's referred to as the total capital budget. Council has discretion to review any particular project and decide to take a project in or out of the budget. And occasionally there are discussions about the scope of the budget. Regarding specific questions on a project, I'm happy to answer the question generally speaking. First of all, to clarify, the hot in place recycling project that is going to go ahead this year was actually created with funds from previous years. So there's no 2021 budget allocations going towards that project. And that project is slated to happen on roads other than Cambrian Heights Drive. So I'm not sure if the caller perhaps heard some information that may have confused that fact, but the roads that are being worked on do not include Cambrian Heights Drive or Bancroft Drive for that matter. The roads that are being selected, MR35, I believe MR80, and also parts of the Kingsway are what we would refer to as open dish cross-section style of roadways. And the intent is to resurface the entire asphalt surface from the edge of asphalt to edge of asphalt. So hopefully that addresses the specific question. And again, if there's any additional clarification, I'm available.
Thank you. And a question from Councillor Jakubo.
Thanks, Sasha. And thank you, Tony, for answering some of the more technical parts of the question regarding capital projects and hot in place asphalt recycling. But I want to take the opportunity to highlight hot in place asphalt recycling because you know, this is a strategic opportunity for council to really get more value out of the tax dollars that we're collecting and not just rely on the same strategies or the same ways we do projects for road resurfacing. So HIR, or hot in place asphalt recycling, you know, was popular a few decades ago. It has seen a resurgence, and what we see with the opportunity for hot in place asphalt recycling is the ability to effectively resurface a much larger component of our road network in a year compared to traditional asphalt recycling. So it's a strategic opportunity that our council has selected as an approved project to take place in 2021. And it's one of the ways that we continue to try to get great value for the tax dollars of Greater Sudburyans.
Thank you so much. One more for you, Mr. Chikuti. How are the savings from reduced plow and sanding services this winter going to be allocated?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, that question comes up quite often with surpluses and over expenditures in that account number. So the approximate cost of our winter control services is about 21 million. I think in the 2021 budget, it's approaching $22 million. The cost of that service will vary from year to year. We've had under expenditures some years, and we've had over expenditures some years. There is a reserve fund set up called the Winter Control Reserve Fund. And the intent of that reserve fund is to have a balance of money available. So if there are over expenditures, the intent would be to draw funds from that reserve. If there are under expenditures, then we put the budgeted money into the reserve fund at the end of the year. For 2020, there is a projection of close to $500,000 of under expenditures. So the intent would be at the end of 2020, when the year-end balance is finally completed, I believe that's around April or May that those calculations are done. That balance would be put into the account and available to be spent in year 2021 or any future year if there is an overdraw required. If things continue as they did in March, we should be good for 2021 as well. And I may have just jinxed the whole program by talking about the weather in January.
Thank you. Also in relation to roads, Timmins has purchased pothole patching machine. Why not Sudbury?
Thank you, Sasha. So there is a business case in the budget for this year for council's consideration, that will be part of the discussion for this year.
Thank you. Our next question, why do we not sell all recreational venues, sell arenas, pools, and ski hills to the private sector? Mr. Jakes.
Thank you, Sasha. Appreciate the question. The city we've developed, and it's on our website, the City Parks, Open Space, and Leisure Master Plan. And this indicates the city is the primary provider of parks and leisure infrastructure within the community. This allows us for the stewardship over these tax-supported assets and ensures affordable and equitable access to parks and recreational opportunities for all residents. The Leisure Master Plan for the city also calls for us to look for partnerships and collaborations with outside parties in the provision of various services, delivery of parks, leisure facilities, and to ensure that where it's desired, there's sufficient benefit to the community and to the city in doing so with the private operator. As you may recall, back last year, we had the core services review where they did indicate the city should explore possible third-party operation of certain facilities such as ski hills, which staff are currently working into our future plans. Ultimately, the selling of any asset or alternative service delivery, for example, for parks or any recreational facilities, are subject to council's direction and to their decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. I live in the Flour Mill area and work downtown. I have seen quite a few news stories lately about major drug busts, and I do acknowledge the importance of getting substances like fentanyl off the streets. We obviously need some kind of comprehensive plan with associated funding to address addiction, poverty, and homelessness. The COVID pandemic has compounded this crisis and it can't wait. What measures will be taken to protect and assist vulnerable people in downtown Sudbury beyond just getting drugs off the street?
So I think that comes to me as well, Sasha. So thank you for the question. Since the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things the pandemic has highlighted is our vulnerable population and our marginalized population in the city of Sudbury. As noted in other comments before, this population is usually hidden by all the activity that goes on in the city, especially in the downtown core, the hustle and bustle of day-to-day activities. Those individuals are all but invisible or forgotten by most of the community. The pandemic has really, with the absence of all that activity, has really highlighted the needs and the gaps within our community. And if you recall, 2 weeks ago, we hosted with council a feedback session, a listening session by council for those with lived experience, the service providers within our community that deliver services to our marginalized and vulnerable population. From that, we will develop actions, recommendations for City Council to take. Since the beginning of the pandemic, I just want to remind everyone, since the beginning of the pandemic, the city has been working with our community partners, such as Shigok-Makwe, Canadian Mental Health Association, Centre de Santé, SASI, Swans, and Blue Door, to mention a few of those, for the provision of daytime and overnight warming centers, provide food security for our most vulnerable and marginalized, access to emergency shelters, and direction of individuals to other secure shelter opportunities within the city should they require it, showers, and housing. As well, we've been working with those community partners to ensure that there's addictions and mental health services being offered to those individuals where they need it. These efforts have been evolving since the beginning of the pandemic. As you can imagine, the situation changes. We are seeing a an increase in the number of individuals requiring services, such that I've mentioned. And we are working hard to address those on a permanent basis. As you can imagine, a lot of the funding that we have received is not permanent funding. A lot of these services and requirements to address them are provincial responsibilities. So we're working with our provincial partners as well to advocate for permanent funding. On a more permanent basis, what I can tell you is that Council has directed staff to prepare a business case for this budget cycle for the creation of a permanent transitional housing units, as well as operational supports for addictions and mental health for their consideration. So that will be coming forward during this business cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Bigger, would you like to add to that?
Sure, Sasha, thank you very much. And just to add, you know, our city council has learned a lot over the last year and really focused and supported efforts to support people that are in crisis in our downtown. And you know, I absolutely understand the importance of advancing our efforts to addressing the homelessness and the opioid crisis. And I'm very committed to working with our partners in relation to those issues. As Mr. Jakes did describe, there have been a lot of efforts, and these are complex issues. The people that are experiencing these challenges don't have only one of these challenges. Often it's not only homelessness, it's homelessness, potentially also plus mental health challenges or addictions. And so it's not as simple as necessarily putting a roof over somebody's head in all cases. So we absolutely understand the urgency, particularly in the cold weather, of providing additional warming center spaces and places to eat indoors throughout the winter here. And council has given direction to staff to identify more permanent transitional housing, affordable housing supports, other supports to help people find the services they need for mental health and addictions challenges that they're facing. Some of these people may face these challenges their entire lives, and we realize that. And what's really important is the funding and the support that we're advocating for from the provincial and federal governments as partners. Many of these programs traditionally are funded through the provincial and federal government, but that has not stopped council in making significant investments, and will continue to do that. So as we've said, we're working with, we work with the YMCA, Overnight Warming Center, the Homelessness Network Day Center, the Samaritan Center, SASE, and these are some of the key groups, Canadian Mental Health Association, and we're working with them constantly as well. I've been supporting our public health officials and our community drug strategy in looking for more permanent supports through supervised consumption site and rehab facilities and such. So they're very high on our radar. Things have definitely changed. There is definitely a much stronger focus and investment in providing these types of supports. And I feel very supported by the rest of council on these, providing these types of supports. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mayor and Mr. Jakes. Our next question, why can't the city have a tax increase of 0.92% like Barrie, Ontario?
Hey, Sasha, it's Ed, and I can start to address this question. I think the short answer is council can make that decision if it wishes to do so. The effect, of course, would be a further change in some of the services that we deliver, to ensure that we maintained a balanced budget. So the amount of tax change that we recommend to committee is a function of what our judgment looks like about what service levels should be. The committee will review that plan and they will decide through their deliberations whether to make some further changes. And those changes could include a focus that emphasizes a lower level of taxation. The services that would need to be adjusted would be something that we could help them identify, but they would ultimately have to decide how to address to ensure that we maintained a balance between revenues coming in and expenditures that we incur for those services. So the short answer again, we could have that level of change. It would have a further adjustment to services required that we don't yet have identified, but we could readily do so if that was council's direction. I would ask at this point, Sasha, whether the chair, the vice chair, or Mayor Bigger had any perspectives about whether that type of change in taxation would be something that the committee would want further information about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Archer. And I want to thank you, Mr. Archer, for the very technical explanation of the tax increase. I really want to thank the resident for their question, because I think it presents a great opportunity to illustrate how the basket of services that we provide here in Greater Sudbury is not that much different from what's provided in a city like Barrie. The costs associated with those services are not that different overall. But what is a big difference between a city like Barrie and a city like Greater Sudbury is that although Greater Sudbury is the one city in Northern Ontario that is experiencing measurable growth, that growth is somewhere around 1%. But in a place like Barrie, that level of growth is probably closer to 10%. And when you have greater assessment growth or a growth in the tax base, that allows the property tax or the budget to be spread over more taxpayers. And so if you look at page 88 in the budget binder, you see that for our budget 2021, we're looking at assessment growth here of only about 0.5%. When in a place like Barrie, as I said, that assessment growth might be more like 5 or 10%. And that's how you can come out to a tax increase of 0.9% for a place like Barrie, but not necessarily for a place like Greater Sudbury.
Thank you all. Next question. Why can't the city eliminate the flat rate charges on water bills? Maybe Mr. Stankiewicz?
Thank you, Sasha. This is a common question we get every budget year. I'll try to explain the importance of having a fixed rate or fixed charge on the water wastewater bill. First off, I want to mention that the water wastewater rate structure used by our city is used by the majority of municipalities in Ontario. The proportion of fixed revenue of the total water bill is about 43%, again, which is comparable to other municipalities in Ontario, as identified in the BMA study, and it's around 42% for the median. Water budgets contain fixed costs that do not change in direct proportion to water consumption. The cost to treat and distribute municipal water remains constant, regardless of the volume consumed by the residents. The fixed water charge provides the city with a stable source of annual funding to offset these fixed costs. The fixed water charge is set for a residential meter at 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch, and is increased with each larger size in accordance with the ratios established by American Water Wastewater Association. Again, the city undertook a rate study in 2009 and again in 2017. The study supported the current structure in place as a blend between fixed and variable cost. A rate structure solely based on variable rates could expose the city to significant revenue losses, while a fixed rate component reduces that risk. The wastewater surcharge is applied to offset the cost associated with water discharge as it leaves the home or business. Costs associated with the operation and maintenance of the wastewater infrastructure, such as the sewer pipes and the treatment plants that handle the wastewater outflow from the properties, can be measured. Wastewater outflow is directly related to the amount of water discharged into the sewer system and treatment plants. Again, with the residential properties not having an outflow meter, this is the only avenue we have to charge for wastewater expenditures. That's why the surcharge is calculated as a percentage of the water rate. Again, the rate structure that we have in place in the City of Greater Sudbury is consistent with most Ontario municipalities. So that's why the fixed charge should be remain in place for water, wastewater bills.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Thanks. I think, thanks for the question. I think that just like we talked about earlier about emergency services and things like, and it's a third of your tax bill and you may never use it, but you want it there when you call 911 and all that, the equipment and the people and everything else, they're just sitting there on standby. And I think about the water system as the same way. You may never turn the tap on, but it's all there waiting for you so that when you want it, it will be there. So all the lift stations and all the pumping and all the people that highly skilled people to take care of our water system, to make sure our water is safe all the time. They are there almost on standby. Even if you go away for 6 months, there's a fixed cost to bringing that water to the edge of your property. And I think that that's what we have to understand. There's this thing that all this, I mean, I think because people don't see all these buildings the way we do, we've seen all these things, these lift stations and everything else that have to be taken care of, that it's sitting there waiting, even if you're not using it, but you want it there when you do turn the tap on. And I think when we talk about that fixed charge, it's there to pay for that thing that's just waiting. Just like some of your taxes are paying for a police service or an ambulance or fire trucks that you may never use, but it's there so that when you call 911, they can come. I just wanted to translate into regular language what the fixed cost is of having it there so that when you want it, it'll be there. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Councillor McIntosh. Our next question, we had several similar questions on this topic. How is our city answering the global and local calls to defund the police? We must take swift action to divest from police service and invest in communities of care. Example, housing, education, social supports. The safest communities are not the ones with the most police. They are the ones with the most resources. Council must recognize this and act accordingly. Instead, you have approved a 5% increase to an already overinflated police budget. How can you justify this? Furthermore, what mechanism do you have in place to mandate police services to reduce their budget? A recent article I read described that the police budget was set and approved by their board, and City Council could only ask the board to consider further cuts, but it can't order it to do so. Why doesn't the City Council, my apologies. Why doesn't the city rather have final authority over the police budget?
Well, Sasha, I can start the response to these questions. And with respect to the last question, like all cities in Ontario, the provincial government has established a legislation that requires a separation between the political decision-making of a municipal council and the administration of a police service. And they do that through the appointment of board members to a police services board. And it has responsibility for working with the chief to establish the service mix and the service levels that a community receives from its police service. So there's provincial legislation that prevents council from having that direct control. The elements that this questioner is raising are comments that you've heard Chief Pedersen describe in public remarks as well. And there are a variety of steps that are being taken in collaboration with the police to integrate services and avoid, to the extent we can, the opportunity for a uniformed patrol officer to attend a call for service that could be better addressed by a non-uniform officer, like a bylaw officer, for example, or in the case of social services calls, coordinating with our director of Ontario Works or our social services directors to facilitate access to the right services. And that kind of coordination happens regularly. It is the case, as we all, I think, know and can appreciate, that late in the morning or early in the morning, depending on how you want to consider it, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, call for service is going to come. There aren't as many options available. And that often is the case. The police are available and they will respond because, as Chief Pedersen will also tell you, it isn't clear what the nature of the circumstances are that drove the call. And there can be some risk to attending a call for service at that time of day. Nonetheless, and I would ask Mr. Jakes to supplement my response with some other examples or some ongoing discussions that we're having. The opportunity to coordinate social services with police services helps avoid the costs that may come from having more officers to be required as a result of these increased social services calls. We're actively managing that problem. With respect to the level of control Council has over the police budget itself, Council receives the board's recommendation for a change in budgeting, and its responsibility at that point is to simply agree with the board or decline the board's request and ask it to reconsider. If the board decides it doesn't want to, then the province has set up basically an arbitration process to facilitate a resolution. But it is in the context of managing that separation between political decision-making and the administration of the police service that relationship exists. So Sasha, if it's okay with you, I just asked Steve Jakes to step in and describe some of the more specific examples of staff in the Community Development Department, for example, or our partners in community agencies that Steve regularly works with, undertake to coordinate with the police service to minimize calls for service for police officers where others can either help instead or supplement the police's response.
Sorry, Mr. Archer, before Mr. Jakes steps in, we'll just ask Mayor Bigger to add something here.
Yeah,
of course.
Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Archer, for that response. And you know, I absolutely agree that a crisis worker, those type of social supports are something that would be beneficial to work alongside police officers. It's in the city's best interest to build a system of safety that's rooted in care to prevent crime in our community and to provide services that are not necessarily the most appropriately provided by a police officer. And so absolutely social services play an important role and part in helping our community thrive. And I've had a number of conversations with Mr. Jakes, and particularly in recent times about these particular opportunities. I can tell you that I'm doing everything that I can from the city's perspective to assist. And then again, some of this does come back to partnerships with the provincial and federal government. You know, we require additional investments by the upper levels of government to invest in mental health and addiction supports and social services. But I think it's very clear that there are, in many cases, you know, more appropriate responses to some of the calls that the police do receive. And so well worth investigating further. Just a little bit on the police budget. What you're seeing at 4.8, which was presented to council, we requested that they would come back at 3.9%. They started off somewhere around the 7.5% that we were identifying initially with our budget, and they found ways to reduce their budget down to 4.8. And so they've come a part of the way. We really, according to the Police Services Act, we don't have the authority to force them to deliver a budget, let's say at 3.9%. And so this is the budget that they have presented as an independent board of police following the Police Services Act. So I'll now pass it on to Steve Jakes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Archer. So I'll just highlight one example of a very complex and robust partnership that we do have in the city to help respond to some of these calls, and that is our rapid mobilization table. The Sudbury Greater Police Services have a full-time member that sits on that table, along with a number of mental health and addictions partners in the community. And when a call does come in, or we are alerted to a situation of a person in need, in a lot of cases, that normally with the absence of a table like this would go to either police or to bylaw to respond. And not always, as Mr. Archer alluded to, is that the most appropriate response that is required by that individual. So in cases like that, if we understand that a person is in distress and in need of some assistance, but it's not necessarily requires a police response or even a bylaw response, they can reach out to the rapid mobilization table. We can dispatch through that our social service outreach workers to that individual and provide them with the help. And it may be a familiar face to them, as a lot of our outreach workers are working in concert with our vulnerable and marginalized population on a regular basis, either through shelter outreach or through on the street outreach. So it may be a familiar face to help that individual get to the service that they need, whether it be accessing some medical care through HSN, or whether it's a paramedic call that can provide them with the service, or it gets them into some other addictions or mental health services, or they require shelter. And that is a very non-confrontational approach that we use, but the police are very involved in that, in trying to deflect as many of those calls as possible to that. One other partnership that is developing is through the Health Sciences North, the Local Health Integration Network, as well as police services, with the support of the city and the provincial funding and the support of the mayor, is looking at taking that a step further and working through the dispatch with police services and actually dispatching mental health workers, nurses, to scenes that require that specific response. The police may assist in getting them there in an urgent manner, but would not be the first person on the scene to address the individual. That will be done by healthcare professionals, mental health and addiction workers, and outreach workers, and really help to de-escalate for that individual, get them to the right service. So there is a lot of work that is going on. We also heard through the listening session with council of the need for a different approach and thinking outside the box. A lot of good suggestions came through that, and we'll be taking those back and looking at what we can implement with our community partners to ensure that we're getting the right response for the right situation to help our most vulnerable and marginalized citizens. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for that. This next question is related to metered parking. Council waived metered parking in the downtown for roughly 3 months last year, and there has been a pretty visible reduction in the number of vehicles downtown throughout the pandemic. What type of economic impact has this had? And is metered parking fees increases something that the city is looking at for 2021?
Thank you for the question, Sasha. If it's okay with you, I'd like to hand this off to Mr. Folk. Among his responsibilities in corporate services is responsibility for our parking services, and he's been engaged in the variety of improvements we've made to parking services over the last couple of years, including pay-by-plate technology. So, Mr. Folk, if perhaps you could offer either some additional context or the details of the response to the question that Sasha just asked us.
Thank you, Mr. Archer, and thank you again, Sasha. The question is a good one, and it's outlined in the budget booklet this year around, and our budget challenges as a key COVID challenge. It's one of kind of 3 major areas, along with leisure services and transit, that were severely impacted, I would suggest, by a COVID response and by reduced traffic, in particular in the downtown. Many people working in the downtown now working from home, and we anticipate that situation is going to persist. And so there are no user fee increases in the base budget or in the draft budget that's been tabled, and there is no business case, and there was one last year, in fact, to make an increase in the fees. as we look at the rates for our lots, we believe they are in sort of the right kind of framework to encourage longer term stays in the downtown to go to a lot instead of cycling around and creating traffic in the downtown and potentially creating a safety issue and creating access issues for businesses and restaurants and the like in the downtown for on-street parking. Our on-street parking is priced quite low, even in comparison to our lots. And so that would be an area in future we would be looking to potentially increase, but there are no increases in the draft budget as of yet. I'd have to check, and perhaps Mr. Stankiewicz could help me here, but at last check, I believe the parking revenue losses, or at least shortfall for 2020 was in the order of $980,000. So nearly $1 million in terms of lost parking revenue throughout the year. So really, really significant impact, obviously. Your parking fees aren't on the levy. So as Mr. Archer's pointed out, and Mr. Stankiewicz has pointed out about water, wastewater, they're paid entirely by fees. And so none of that goes on the tax levy that's often the focus of our budget discussions. If in a year where we're not losing that scope of money, there is a surplus, it goes into a reserve fund for future parking improvements. We've got large projects in the downtown that may require parking. And so council's actively looking at what it might mean if we had those large projects in place and what the requirements and the demand would be for parking. Certainly in a post-COVID world, that is less clear perhaps now than ever. And in fact, the parking reserve that I'm talking about also not only does not get any contribution this year, in a year where the revenues are so low, there is actually an amount that does impact the net taxation outcome from 2020. That's how low the parking revenues were for 2020. So I hope that helps us in terms of some background. And again, Mr. Stankiewicz can correct me, and/or we can mop up the exact number in terms of lost revenue throughout the Q&A process, throughout the budget process, if that helps, either online or in subsequent communication.
Thank you. We have, oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to supplement Mr. Folk's answer. Yes, we had about $1 million loss in parking revenue, and as such, there was no contribution to the parking reserve for parking lot improvements in the budget.
Thank you both. This is our last question of the evening. Why are we again looking at arena locations when they have a place already picked out, the Kingsway Entertainment District project? This is a waste of taxpayers' dollar to yet again drag out this issue when ground should have been broken 2 years ago.
Well, Sasha, I'll start the response, and thanks for the question. I think the simple answer to the question why is because it has been 2 years, and whether ground should have broken 2 years ago or not, there were legitimate objections raised about the decision of the day that needed to be vetted. That process is complete, and now we can proceed. But with the passage of time, it's prudent for the volume of the investment that we're talking about here to check the assumptions that we made and to check whether conditions have changed to ensure that the expected result we wanted is still the result we're getting. So that's what we're doing. The discussion that council had just the other night is not about reevaluating all of these choices again. It is about validating the information that's been produced both at the time the decision for this direction was taken and the information that's been produced since then to give council the assurance that the direction it's following for building an asset that will probably be here for the next 50 years is based on a sound body of knowledge. So that's the process that's underway. Mr. Wood is leading that process on council's behalf. And over the next 2.5 months, we'll produce information and analysis with help from experts where we need it to give council an opportunity to review whether anything's changed, and if so, whether those changes reflect enough of a change to reframe their thinking about the direction that we're taking. But it is about creating some assurance and giving the community an opportunity for a fact-based discussion about the direction that's been selected. And Sasha, I recognize that this is something that council has just recently engaged in dialogue about. I would ask Mayor Bigger or Councillor Jakubo or Councillor McIntosh if there's anything further to add to the response, just to make sure that I've covered the bases.
Go ahead, Mayor Bigger.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Mr. Archer, and thank you for the question. Obviously, it was a topic of discussion last night, and council did approve moving forward to get important information, factual, relevant, current information, and have that all put into a concise report that would be obviously openly shared with the public and all of council, all of staff. Everybody's got a vested interest in investments that we're planning to make in our community. And so I think you also heard last night, there are a number of questions that council wants to ask and the public want to ask at this very moment. And with COVID-19 and some of these questions yet to be answered, we'll know a lot more in June. The report will prepare us and position us to be able to move forward. And so you would, as your elected representatives, you would expect us to ask those important questions before we make major investments. And this particular investment would be the largest investment in the history of the city of Greater Sudbury. And it quite frankly has been since June of 2017. And so it's just with the passage of time, it is absolutely worth the effort at this moment to solidify what we know and what we need to know to understand the risks. And looking at Councillor McIntosh, understand what we now know that we didn't know before, and understand what the risks are in making decisions, or what answers we need to get to move forward. And so I want to see the community on board for investments and understanding why we're making decisions and understanding the facts that our decisions are being made upon. And there's been a lot of information that has been presented to the public through different venues over the last few years. And so this is an opportunity to solidify, as I said, the factual, relevant, current information, consideration of all the elements that we need to consider to move forward with a project of this size.
Thank you all very much. We will conclude the budget information session now. A reminder, we are keeping the Q&A tool open on Over to You, and we'll continue to accept and answer your questions until the budget is finalized in March. And if we didn't get to your questions tonight, you will find those answers there as well. We will also be posting a Q&A document with some great information about the municipal budget. You'll find that at greatersudbury.ca/budget and overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good night.